people tend to conflate fundamentalism with fanaticism. That's almost become a stereotype. So I just want to make a couple of points of clarification. First of all, where does this term fundamentalism come from? It actually has its original meaning from a movement here in the US, a Christian anti-modernist movement that wanted to get back to biblical fundamentals. And so in the 1910s and 1920s, there were a series of booklets called The Fundamentals that were circulated that tried to combat some tendencies in biblical scholarship, coming especially from Germany. And also they wanted to combat the, as they saw it, very dangerous and threatening teaching of evolution. And so this movement, which has its origins in the US, has gone on to lend its name to other movements in other parts of the world. So today, for example, we talk, in some cases, people will talk about Islamic fundamentalism or even different kinds of fundamentalism in other parts of the world or other countries. And so it's important not to confuse these two. On the one hand, American Protestant fundamentalism, which has a very specific history and a very strong influence on American politics and culture, and then also this more generalized concept of fundamentalism. You might say American fundamentalism has a capital F, and generic fundamentalism has a small f. And I'm drawing some of these definitions from a Harvard theologian named Grant Wacker, who teaches religious studies at Harvard. And he makes some interesting clarifications about this. So just to talk for a moment about American fundamentalism, first of all, there was a movement, especially in Germany, to try to find the historical origins of the Bible. And one of the things they discovered, of course, is that the Bible has many different authors and consists of a number of texts from different origins. And so they were very interested in approaching this from a scientific point of view. And this very much clashed with an American Protestant sensibility that said that the Bible is basically directly from God, is authoritative in every sense of the word, and actually should be seen as being scientific. So explanations about the origins of humanity in the Bible should be seen as absolutely, historically, and literally true. Because of this difference between the Christian fundamentalist movement here in the US and, you might say, mainstream US culture, what we've seen is really the origins of what today they call the culture wars. On the one hand, you have a group of people that believe literally in the teachings of the Bible. On the other hand, you have people that believe in evolution. And so you end up starting to see a kind of a ideological conflict and an intellectual battle going on between these two forces. The fundamentalist movement has organized itself and created its own schools, universities. In many cases, parents are preferring to homeschool their children to, quote unquote, protect them from the influence of the teachings of evolution. And so this movement has had a profound effect on American politics and American conservatism. And these ideological differences tend to also shake down, in political terms, liberal versus conservative, sometimes even Republican versus Democrat. And so there's an awful lot of cultural, political, ideological, and religious conflict that derives from this term fundamentalism that's kind of taken on such a negative connotation. Now, as I mentioned, this term has then been applied elsewhere in the world to represent any kind of anti-modernist religious movement that's attempting to resist the secularization of culture, and also quite often the democratization of culture, because many of these fundamentalist religious groups in different parts of the world are opposed to the idea of representative democracy and prefer instead the idea of theocracy. And you can see how that would cause many problems both internally and also globally. Some of the other implications of this would be a tendency to prefer traditional arrangements having to do with gender. So the role of women in many fundamentalist cultures is seen as not being equal to the role of men. And in addition to that, there are very traditional lines of authority between parents and children, and also clergy and the laity. And again, religious truth is seen as being ultimate. Typically, religious fundamentalists have a sacred text, whether it's the Bible or the Quran or any number of other texts, that is elevated above all other texts, all other documents, whether they're political or intellectual in any other way. Now, just to finish my brief remarks on the topic of fundamentalism, because this discussion about fundamentalism has become so polarized, and because there are so many conflicts of so many different kinds involved in the discussions of fundamentalism, it's actually very easy for people who are not fundamentalists themselves to develop a set of stereotypes and prejudices about those who are fundamentalists. And I just want to say that even though there are some very serious concerns about the spread of certain kinds of fundamentalism, which actually do overlap with fanaticism, at the same time I want to mention that I have family members who are fundamentalists. Probably many of you have family members too. People who are religious fundamentalists very often are passionate about their faith. Quite often they're sincerely seeking to live a spiritual life. I think the point that I'm trying to make is that if we want to truly actualize and manifest a real teaching of unity and oneness, it doesn't really help us if we demonize and otherize people who may have some different beliefs than we do. So I think that hopefully our discussion today will be illuminating in this way. It can talk about some of the excesses of fundamentalism, the point at which fundamentalism starts to bleed into fanaticism, sometimes in very violent and destructive ways. And yet, on the other hand, I think it would be good if we can remember that this organization, and probably all of us, really are concerned about developing dialogue, about developing respect, about truly trying to understand and empathize with the positions that other people have, even if we strongly disagree with them, and also to remember that our ultimate goal is really the unity of all people. So I guess the questions that are in my mind, and they may not all be answered today, have to do with how do we dialogue with people who are fundamentalists? How do we understand their positions? Are there ways of finding common ground? Are there ways of respectfully disagreeing? Are there ways of persuading and convincing? And are there ways in which perhaps we might need to be persuaded and convinced ourselves? Perhaps there are beliefs that some fundamentalists have that actually could be very useful and enlightening. So I hope that that sets a respectful tone for all of our comments today, and I look forward to hearing from our distinguished speakers on a very important topic. So thank you so much.